I'm Daniel James, and you're listening to 7am. Anthony Albanese leads a party that no longer argues in public. Labor presents as unified, consistent and on message. But behind that unity is another story. One where a party once defined by its dissent and debate has become scared of conflict, to the point where its identity is formed not by beliefs, but by a commitment to staying in power no matter what. Sean Kelly has worked up close with Anthony Albanese and with Labor Prime Ministers before him, and he's been interrogating what the government stands for and what its legacy will be.
I've had this very odd experience watching this government, which is that something about it has always puzzled me. And that's part of where this essay came from. I was trying to think, what does this government believe?
Today, author of the new quarterly essay, The Good Fight, Sean Kelly, on what happens when political identity is built on belonging, not belief. It's Monday, November 17. Sean, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's great to see you again. Anthony Albanese recently stated that he's never seen the Labor Party more united, and he went on to say that that's a virtue.
What I'm focused on is my united team that are focused on the needs of Australians.
When you look at the Labor Party as it stands today, do you see unity?
Look, I do see unity. In some ways, the party is as unified as it's ever been. But another way of putting that would be to say that the caucus is perhaps the quietest Labor caucus I can remember. And I think that does point to a couple of things which you can frame in different ways. If you're a politician, you might say, well, that's great. It's a unified party with very little leaking, with very little dissent. Great. That allows us to go ahead with our political goals. But I think on the other side of things, it means that you don't necessarily have the type of debate you need to reach the best possible solutions. And I think this is really interesting if you look at it in terms of Labor's history. There has always been, right from its very beginnings, a struggle within Labor. And that struggle is between idealism and pragmatism, between heading for the best possible society, which once upon a time many people in Labor would have called socialism, by which they didn't mean socialism exactly as we understand it, but a form of equality, and pragmatism, the desire to win elections. And I think one of the really strange things about Labor is that struggle now seems to be inaudible. It's very hard to say whether that struggle still exists or whether the party has started to prioritise winning elections far more than anything else.
What do you attribute this lack of internal debate and dissent to, Sean? I mean, it's very un-Labor-like.
Yeah, look, it is. I think you've got a few factors here. Firstly, you have the fact that it's become pretty much taboo to say, I am a socialist. You know, once upon a time, people could describe their beliefs with a single word. I'm a communist, I'm a socialist, I'm an anti-communist. And with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the death of the Soviet Union, I think our landscape of belief kind of collapsed into a flat plane. And I think that means that the Labor Party doesn't have that very clear ideal towards which it's heading anymore. And the lack of a clear ideal is a problem because what an ideal does is it provides a mechanism of accountability. You can always compare yourself to that ideal and say, well, look at the things we're doing. Are they helping us get closer to that thing? But I don't think Labor feels as though it has a clear ideal which it can articulate. The second thing that's happened is that battle, that struggle used to go on within the Labor Party. But at some point, the Greens came along. And I think that has meant over time that ideal, that pursuit of policy purity has migrated outside the Labor Party into the Greens. And I think that is part of why you don't see such debate within the Labor Party. And I think it has also meant that the Labor Party has almost started to define itself in opposition to that idea of pursuing ideals.
But for the Greens political party, this isn't about the Australian people. This is about them. They want the issue, not the outcome. They deal in protests. We focus on progress.
And that has seen pragmatism come even further to the fore. And so I think this means that there is an overall difficulty in Labor, which is that it's not entirely clear what Labor is trying to do anymore.
So what's been the cost of that sort of lack of friction within the caucus? I mean, how has it changed the way that the Labor Party is actually governing at the moment?
I think you can see it in certain policy areas. The one that comes to mind most readily is gambling, when the party has been willing to say, we will do something about gambling, but we won't ban online ads, which is the thing that everybody, of course, has been talking about. And I think you see the party often stopping short of things. You know, they'll say, we will do something about supermarket pricing, but we will defend the existence of this Coles Woolworths oligopoly. And again, we see Labor Party just kind of step clear from the strongest possible answer to things. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing in each individual instance. But as a whole, I think what it adds up to is a party that is incredibly conflict averse. And that is actually something the party has been talking about right from the start. They would boast about not frightening the horses, by which they meant, not provoking huge debates, not provoking their opponents to come out and bash them. And that was, in certain respects, successful. But I think the question is whether over time that costs the Labor Party something else. And I think it does. I think, again, you come back to this question. If it's not fighting these fights, if it's not willing to go into battle with entrenched interests, then what exactly is it that it cares about?
Coming up, Albanese's three great faiths: Labor, the Catholic Church, and the Rabbitohs. Sean, Albanese tells us that the party is unified under a Labor hat. So, to the question, what does the party currently stand for? That's the heart of your essay.
Yeah, look, I think that this Labor hat thing is so interesting. Jim Chalmers described the Labor Party this year as centrist.
Obviously, there are some things that governments, sensible, middle of the road, centrist governments like ours don't consider. We don't consider inheritance taxes. We don't consider changing the arrangements for the family home, those sorts of things.
And as Richard Dennis wrote this year, the difficulty with centrist is that it means you're not defining yourself in relation to particular beliefs. You're just defining yourself according to who's on the right of you and who's on the left of you. You're essentially a little tugboat being tossed by great waves. Anthony Albanese, when I put that label, centrist, to him in 2023, said, we're Labor. And that to me sounds better, but I still think it doesn't leave us with a much clearer sense of what the party stands for. And I think this is related to a trend in Anthony Albanese's rhetoric, which is it's often defined in negative terms rather than in positive terms, by what Labor wants not to do rather than what it wants to do. So you could see this when he was talking about the Australian way during the election campaign. It started with a determination not to be like America, not to be Donald Trump. And it would say, we don't need to copy the ideologies of any other nation.
Why on earth would we try to mimic anywhere else? We don't want a wages system where people have to rely on tips to make ends meet. We don't want Australian students burdened by a lifetime of debt. And we never, ever, ever want an American-style health system in this country.
Which is fair enough, but it is saying Australia should be, as it is now, not like something else. And he did a similar thing when he was asked early this year what he meant with his famous phrase, I like fighting Tories.
I like fighting Tories. That's what I do. That's what I do.
And he said, well, what that means is not giving up the gains that have been made. And I think that's a fascinating way to describe it, because it's looking backwards. It's saying we don't want to give up what has already been done, not about fighting for new things, not about fighting for change. And that is a really conservative framing for the Australian Labor Party. It's a really conservative framing for any centre-left party, because centre-left parties have traditionally been about change. And I think it's really interesting that Anthony Albanese constantly defines himself by reference to the three great faiths he has, the Labor Party, the Catholic Church, and the South Sydney Rabbitohs.
I say that I was raised with three great faiths, the Labor Party, the Catholic Church, and South Sydney Rugby League Football Club by my mum. And that
Because what I think that really means is he's defining himself by tribes. It's not a set of beliefs, it's institutions that he belongs to and supports. I think that's interesting because it is, on some level, defining yourself in opposition rather than with reference to a particular belief, to a particular thing you were trying to do.
Albanese has said he didn't know why anyone would go into politics if they didn't want to leave a legacy. So what do you think he wants his legacy to be?
I think he would point to two things. One, he would say, I want to leave behind me universal childcare. And that absolutely may still happen. But it is worth noting that the progress towards universal childcare has been much slower than the government foreshadowed early on, and the time frame has kept slipping a little bit. But that is certainly one aspect of what he would hope to be his legacy.
Our Labor government believes firmly that every child should have the right to quality, affordable, early education.
The other thing that he points to is the transition to renewable energy. And the government believes very strongly that this is a revolutionary thing, that this is the most significant thing that they are doing, that it is a huge wave of economic change, and also, of course, change the way we approach the climate.
Every Australian who knows that climate change is a challenge we must act together to meet for the future of our environment. And knows the fact that renewable energy is an opportunity we must work together to seize for the future of our climate.
Again, there are really big questions about just how much Australia's emissions are falling. And you also have to factor in the fact, which the Albanese government basically likes to ignore, which is that Australia is in the top 5 exporters of fossil fuel emissions around the world. I mean, that is a staggering fact that really should shame us as a country, but we just don't talk about it.
So how do you think he's going in terms of achieving the legacy that he's hoping to build? How would you assess that at this point?
I think one of the great difficulties in assessing this government, and one of the reasons I've really struggled with what to think of them all the way along, and still do, is that the nature of incrementalism, the nature of approaching things gradually, is that the moment of judgment always seems to be somewhere down the track. If your argument to the Australian people is, we are going about things slowly, we are accumulating small changes over time into something that will be larger and more significant, then you can always say, well, that moment's coming. But I think it's important to remember that we are 3.5 years in. One of the arguments that the government makes is that the reason you need to win several elections is you need to embed changes so that the following government, the following coalition government, can't tear them down. Now, that sounds fair enough, except that when it's applied to previous governments, what you're really talking about is reforms that happened early. Because at this point, let's say the government loses after 3 terms, we're really only talking about a term and a half in which to embed those policies. So I think that incrementalism argument loses power the longer the government is there. And it loses power for another reason too, which is that you could actually look at the results and say, well, are these things being solved? I think there's something really interesting about this decision not to pick fights, this decision to avoid political trouble. It does work in a certain way. It means you don't get strips torn off you. It means you don't have the media piling on your head. These are political advantages. But I think that over time, every Prime Minister's strength ends up becoming their weakness. Every Prime Minister ends up having a quality which works for them. And because it works for them, they lean on it ever more heavily. And because they lean on it too heavily, eventually it ends up hurting them. And you saw that with Gough Whitlam. His boldness meant that he eventually crashed. Similarly, but in the opposite way, Anthony Albanese's caution has worked for him. It may work for him for a longer period. And at some point, if he doesn't learn to balance that caution with boldness in some other respects, then I think that caution could end up hurting him in the same way that Whitlam's boldness ended up hurting him.
Sean, it's a fascinating essay. Thanks so much for coming on the show and talking to us about it.
Thanks so much for having me on. It was lovely to see you again.
Sean Kelly's quarterly essay, The Good Fight, What Does Labor Stand For?, is out today. Also in the news, a deadlock over who will host next year's COP Climate Summit is set to be broken this week, as this year's conference in Brazil comes to an end. Australia is up against Turkey for hosting rights, with the Albanese government hoping to stage the global summit in Adelaide. But despite pursuing the right to host COP, the government has not outlined the cost, with some reports suggesting it could be as high as $2 billion. And Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has endorsed Victorian Premier Jacinta Allan's new juvenile justice laws, which will allow children as young as 14 to be jailed for life for violent crimes. The new measures have been widely criticised for breaching human rights obligations, but the PM described the move as consistent with the Premier's commitment to keeping Victorians safe. We'll bring you an episode on the new laws tomorrow. I'm Daniel James, this is 7am. Thanks for listening.